That whistle a blow, and now I know that we're going. We've just started. Yes, we've departed. Why, we're leaving the pier. I say we're steaming from New York Bay. That's why I feel so gay. If we get there on time, I'll be mighty happy. If we're not there on time, why, I'll feel mighty bad, 'cause we'll sure have some time. Way down in Louisiana, here's what makes them all feel glad.
Who Watches the Watchman was a slogan used consistently in Alan Moore's The Watchmen, a tale of people with amazing abilities policing everyday citizens. In this tale, the Watchmen become too heavy handed and allow pride to get in the way of morality. Citizens who became aware of this danger would ask, who is watching the Watchmen? In our world, when people with authority become too heavy handed and don't act with their conscience, there are many systems in place to ensure that wrongdoers in power also have justice brought down on them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. No system is foolproof. In the case of United States versus Len Davis, the system worked. A broken cop in a system of laws he did not think applied to him, Len Davis is currently serving time in prison on death row. Today, we have the prosecuting attorney for the case, Constantine Georges, to tell us who, what, why, and how someone on the side of the law found himself on the wrong side of it. Just how far down the rabbit hole does the Big Easy system go? Let's ask an expert to find out. Hello, Constantine Georges.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So let's start at the beginning because I hear it's a good place to start. Can you tell me a little bit about how you first got into law when you were growing up in New Orleans?
Oh, well, you never know what the script of fate has in store for you. I originally thought I would be a doctor, and then we had a little tragedy in the family while I was studying pre-med, and I decided not to be involved in hospitals or around hospitals. So really didn't know what I was going to do next. So I decided, well, maybe I'll just give law school a try, and ended up going to Tulane Law School, and ended up moving to England after that and getting another degree in shipping law. I thought, well, maybe I could go to London. I conned my father into thinking I'd meet a Greek ship owner's daughter, and everything would be hunky-dory. And I came back and became a maritime lawyer for 2 years, but realized that I needed to really advance in the civil practice, you really need to have trial experience. So I looked for places that would really give you good trial experience, and it turns out the U.S. Attorney's Office offered me a position, which turned out to be a really great venture.
How long were you a lawyer?
How long was I a lawyer, or I'm still a lawyer?
Right, practicing,
But
I
I
should say.
practiced in the U.S. Attorney's Office for 22 years.
And you were a lawyer for a pretty significant time in New Orleans history. In the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of crime going on.
Yeah, I would say that especially in the 90s, the early 90s, was one of the worst, if not the worst period in our lifetimes in terms of the violent crime in the city.
Well, and you certainly dealt with one of the more significant cases at that time in 1994. Can you tell me a little bit about the United States versus Len Davis?
Well, Len Davis was a police officer with New Orleans Police Department, and it had been rumored that he was not an altogether straight cop, and so over time the FBI had realized that he was corrupt and set up a sting operation to get him and see what other police officers that he was friends with or worked with would be discovered as being also on the take and whatnot. And so for almost a year, they had done an undercover operation, the FBI had, where they sent in an undercover agent and posing as a drug dealer, and had asked for Len Davis to provide protection for his supposedly drug dealing. And so Len Davis would bring other policemen in, and then when the FBI agent told him that he had a shipment that was coming in with marijuana, let's say, Len Davis would meet them, and then they would take him to the warehouse safely. They would unload the marijuana, and then they would pay Len Davis every time they did this. Now, unbeknownst to Len Davis, the FBI had been wiretapping the telephone that he was using. So this had been going on for a year, and as a result, there were many police officers that were being brought into the mix with Len Davis. And but one day, and I wasn't involved in that case. I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office. I was the chief of the Violent Crime Unit at the time, but this was a special investigation done by two top lawyers in the office. But one day I got a knock on the door, and the senior lawyer came in and said, "Look, we've discovered that we think our main target has actually had someone murdered, while this is all going on, And so then the murder case came to me because that's what I used to do was violent crime cases. So they separated the two different investigations, and I had to go through basically a year's worth of tape recordings, and you could then realize that during that period, while Len Davis, let me back up for a second. When they're doing a what they call a wire intercept, when the government does that, it's really only supposed to be listening in on things that involve what you suspect as being the criminal activity. But there could be periods of time when it's some personal thing, so they usually turn it off and they don't listen to it. It's not part of the investigation. But when they went back to listen to all the tapes, because someone within the police department suspected Len Davis, so they basically informed the FBI that they thought he was the prime suspect in a murder that had just occurred one day.
Were the FBI tipped off beforehand, and that's what led to them wiretapping and following Len Davis, or were they investigating the NOPD as a whole, and Len Davis just happened to be a part of it?
Well, they were investigating what was thought to be corruption in the New Orleans Police Department, and then Len Davis was one of the prime suspects in that investigation. He was the leading suspect because he was sort of the leader of this group of policemen that he had control over, and brought them in to do whatever he needed them to do to protect what they thought was a drug dealer's operation.
And you had to comb through like a year's worth. I mean, how long did that take to go through all that recording?
It took a while. To be frank, I ended up with an inner ear infection one day after we indicted him. For some reason, my ears, something happened to my ear. I've been listening to so many tapes. But anyway, but getting back to what happened, so they came into the office, my office, and said, "Look, you're going to have to handle this because there's a murder now. So here are the tapes, listen to the tapes." And meanwhile, they had to stop the other investigation. The FBI had to stop the undercover investigation because they didn't really want anyone else to be killed while they're doing an investigation, even though they didn't know that the murder had occurred while they're listening to the tapes. They had no idea because, as I said, the tapes were designed to listen to Len Davis talk to the other policemen and to the undercover agent about the drug dealing. But there were so many recordings that when someone had alerted them that they thought that he was involved in a separate crime, which was the murder of this woman, they went back and reviewed the tapes, and you could piece little conversations out of the tape over the year, well, not even over the year, over just a couple of days, where Len Davis was setting up the murder of Kim Marie Groves. And so when you extricated the various conversations out of that big recording, it was a complete summation of what he did before and after the murder on tape.
Can you walk me through the story itself of Kim Groves? So it seems that Davis was affiliated with the drug dealers Paul Hardy and
Causey.
And Causey, yes.
And other people, too.
Right.
What happened was, this is back around October of 1994. And so you have to forgive me if my memory isn't perfect.
That's fine.
But Kim Marie Groves was witnessed a police officer. I don't think it was Len Davis. I believe it was Sammy Williams, but she witnessed him roughing up a young kid in the neighborhood.
She claimed pistol whipping her nephew.
Yeah. Well, it turns out that I think it was the wrong identification of a person, but nevertheless, she went to Internal Affairs Division of the police department and filed a complaint, and that's supposed to be completely anonymous. You know, no one is supposed to know when they go to the Internal Affairs Division that you're in Internal Affairs and you're telling them something that's going on. Nevertheless, within 24 hours, Len Davis had her murdered. He had found out somehow that she had filed this complaint, and he set up the murder by calling up his drug dealer associate, Paul Hardy, and told them where she was, identified where she was standing, the exact place, and was on the phone repeatedly telling him that he needs to get out of his house and go and murder this woman, and that's actually what happened. Paul Hardy got in a car with two other people, and they drove to the location where Len Davis had just identified her, and he walked out of the car, walked down a bit, and just shot her in cold blood in the middle of the street, and then got back and left, threw the gun into the industrial canal. Believe it or not, was actually retrieved, that gun. But at the same time, Len Davis was getting on the phone trying to find out if it was confirmed that she had been killed. And when he found out it, you could hear all this joy in his voice on tape, saying how happy he was that he killed her, and like no one should ever mess with him. And he even used the terms "rockabye baby."
I read that in the report. It was a quote from a
movie called New Jack City.
Yeah.
When the female assassin in that movie, just before she was going to kill someone, used to point the gun at him and go "rockabye baby."
How sinister.
Yeah, it was.
Well, and from what I had read in the reports, essentially, he had planned this out with Hardy, where Davis would drive around the neighborhood and say, "Okay, this is where she lives, and I'll scratch your back if you scratch mine. Yeah, I'll cover for you." And so essentially, allegedly, Davis planned out the whole murder and gave Hardy the information he needed, whereas Harvey actually committed the crime, but under the direction of Davis.
That's true. I mean, Len Davis was a complete control freak, so he needed control over everything, and he was very obsessive in making sure that things happened his way. So he went to the location several times, and Paul Hardy was actually sitting in his house having a good time, and he had to call him several times and got really angry with him at one time for not getting out there soon enough.
So I know the law has changed considerably from the 90s until, 2023. I know forensics has changed a great deal, but in terms of law enforcement, to your knowledge, do they do any kind of psychological vetting at this point when it comes to police officers? Like look into to see if you've had any, I don't know, like domestic abuse or history of anger problems, history of outbursts?
I can't really speak to that because that's more law enforcement, either police or the FBI. I'm sure the FBI must definitely have certain tests that they perform on individuals before they allow them to become an FBI agent. And but I wonder if NOPD actually does an actual psychological profile. Be nice to know, but probably never find out.
I believe the FBI does. I did apply for the FBI, and I think they do psychological screenings along with polygraph tests and all that fun stuff. So it's interesting that the FBI was kind of on to the NOPD. From my understanding, I'm not a local to New Orleans, but you are. Can you tell me a little bit about New Orleans NOPD's history at that time? Because they did have kind of a reputation at that time.
Well, unfortunately, the murder occurred, which was most unfortunate for the victim, Miss Groves. But also, it's slightly unfortunate. It's unfortunate for the investigation as a whole, because had it continued, I think they ended up arresting at least 10 officers. but they probably would have ended up arresting 30 or 40 more who all went, once this murder happened and it was revealed, they all went, took deep cover back then, so they were probably still in the force. During that period of time, of course, you had some really bizarre and crazy things happening where there was another police officer, who you may recall, that was ended up murdering her own partner in some Vietnamese that little convenience store where they serve food. And she was supposed to be guarding the place, and she went in and killed them because her boyfriend was a drug dealer, and she went in to get the money. Her name is Antoinette Franks, and she is still on death row as well. But that was all state prosecution. That wasn't a federal case. And the Len Davis case was fairly unique because it was actually a violent crime case, but was prosecuted in federal court. And normally, certain violent crimes, unless they have some interstate commerce connection, or local prosecutions. But this case was a civil rights case, so those were the charges that were used to prosecute him. That he was under the color of state law, he was violating people's constitutional rights, of just the right to live.
Well, and is it a violation of rights too that because her report to Internal Affairs was supposed to be private and it wasn't, was that also one of the charges?
That's a little trickier because if that's a very very debatable legal issue, which is it is an illegal federal crime if you try to tamper with a potential government witness. So if she's witnessing what would be a federal crime, then she would come under the auspices of the federal government's jurisdiction. If she just went into Internal Affairs to file a complaint, and that might not have anything to do with a federal constitutional right, then there wouldn't really be a civil rights issue then.
So walk me through after the charges were brought on to Mr. Davis. On one hand, it seems like it would be a simple issue because he had a year's worth of wiretap phones, and I'm sure he had not been very discreet in a lot of his conversations when he didn't realize he was being wiretapped. So you would think, oh, there's a ton of evidence stacked against him. I'm sure this would be an open and shut case. But simultaneously, he was also an officer of the law, and this was a federal case, which would make it much more difficult. So can you tell me a little bit about the process and how he was able to be convicted?
Well, whenever you have a case, you'd like to get as much evidence and corroborating evidence as possible. So we had evidence on tape of him making statements. All of those are fairly circumstantial statements, which are admissible into evidence, But his partner, Sammy Williams, ended up becoming a government witness, as did the driver of the car, a man named Steve Jackson. So they testified against him, and in combination so they could explain what the tapes meant when he would make a statement about something. They could explain it. Whereas to be frank, the FBI agent that was responsible for listening to the tapes for the corruption case really wasn't listening for a murder to happen. She was listening for other things. But, these statements were made while she was supposedly listening, but it probably didn't resonate with her what he was talking about at the time.
Well, I recall in the reports, it was something to the effect of, in one of the recordings, it was Officer Davis said, we need to get P to deal with that whore, and then let me know when we're done with the 30. And so that is a very cryptic way of describing something over the phone that would be kind of circumstantial. And,
He was Paul.
Right,
He
Keith
was
was
Hardy.
Paul.
And 30 was the statute for homicide.
Mm.
So he wanted Paul to go kill. We can get Paul, to go do the 30, meaning do the murder.
And then that whore referring to Kim Groves.
Correct.
Oh gosh, yeah, but that honestly, that poor woman. But that enough to convince the jury immediately, or was there additional evidence that was brought in that swayed the jury?
Oh, well, I think the evidence as presented was very strong. You had his closest associate, Sammy Williams, testify for a long period of time in detail about Len Davis, both before the murder, after the murder, during the murder, and the type of person he was. Um, you you had Steve Jackson tell that he was asked to drive the car and what he did. So it was a pretty solid case, in my opinion, to prosecute. And the verdict, it didn't take very long for the jury to come back guilty. But
So,
as you may know, I mean, that's what they call the guilt phase of the trial. And normally, in a criminal case, that's not a death penalty case. Once someone has been ruled guilty, then a period of time goes by where the judge will gather information about this individual and then impose sentence. And that usually could be 6 weeks later, you know. But in a death penalty case, the sentence is done by, is the verdict is, again, on whether to give him a death penalty or not is done by the jury. So you had a whole nother 2 phases of a trial to show that he deserved the death penalty as opposed to life imprisonment. Those were the only two choices at the time. So a bunch of evidence was presented. At the prosecutor has to introduce certain aggravating factors, and the defense is entitled to present any mitigation, that they have any mitigating factors. You know, like somebody put a gun to his head and forced him to pull the trigger. That would be a mitigating factor. But what happens is the government presents what they say are aggravating factors, whatever mitigating factors are brought in, and then it's weighed by the jury as to whether they think the aggravating circumstances outweigh the mitigation, and then they vote on that.
was Len Davis's history of being a control freak and all that taken into account? Did he have a long pattern of showing signs of aggression and control that also contributed to his conviction?
I think it. I think where that came in more was on the potential threat of his future dangerousness, meaning that if he was able to use the telephone to call certain people and have certain things done, he didn't have to be there. So that was one of the aggravating factors, is that this man poses a danger to the community and to other people in the future. So he really, I mean, that's one factor. Another factor is, I mean, he never showed remorse at all in the crime. He's never, to this day, he's never showed any remorse about doing it, and that's the type of person that really can't be rehabilitated.
Yeah, and no remorse for a woman who was killed by a drug dealer, all because she reported that a cop pistol whipped somebody. It's an extreme reaction to what would be kind of a mild offense, if you can even interpret it as an offense.
Well, he viewed himself as the big man in that neighborhood. He ruled the roost, so nobody could do anything without his approval, so to speak. And he had a reputation as a RoboCop. They used to call him a RoboCop prior to this, because he really would go in and, sadly, had he had a different mindset, he probably would have been an excellent police officer on one level. But he really did not have the mindset to be a police officer. He should not have ever been in the police force.
No, it does sound like he did lack a lot of compassion and humility, which is unfortunate because, like you said, he had a certain set of skills with his organization and his networking where he could have been a good cop. But I'm curious, as all of this was going on, because he was the big mucky muck in New Orleans when it came to law enforcement, this must have been extremely demoralizing for the NOPD, not to mention a lot of them were complicit in a lot of these crimes. So I'm curious, as this was going on, Who was maintaining civility and stability in New Orleans? Was the FBI enforcing law? Did they pull in police officers from other counties? Because you have to have law enforcement to maintain the peace, especially in a city with high crime rate, especially in the 90s when it was really high. So who was holding down the fort while all of this chaos was going down with the NOPD?
Well, before it became public, in other words, before we brought the indictments public, nobody, maybe one person in the NOPD knew that we were investigating them. So they were operating on their own normally. It's just that obviously we needed to have somebody in the inside to just kind of keep us informed about what may or may not happen. But that was limited to one person, if I understand that correctly. So NOPD was just doing their thing continually, and it's it. Most of the police officers were good police officers, and I said this even in my opening statement. And it's like one rotten apple in the barrel, doesn't make the department rotten.
Sure.
And I think a lot of the police officers at the time, and obviously subsequently that I've met, were glad that they actually got rid of him in the department. So, I don't. People have to understand. I mean, the exceptions, like a Len Davis, should not be viewed as the norm.
Right.
It's not the norm. You have really a lot of hardworking policemen every day that put their necks out on the line, and this just makes their job that much more difficult.
Well, judging by your description of Len Davis's personality, he probably was a huge pain in the ass to work with. So they probably were relieved to just have him out and not deal with that guy anymore.
Well, just to give you an idea of how maniacal he was, at the same time that he killed Kim Groves, there was a new police chief just sworn in. His name was Richard Pennington. Did a great job with the police department at the time. But someone had said, "Oh, to Len," and this is on record. This was being recorded. They said, "Oh, the new police chief, he's not going to put up with a lot of the stuff." And Len's response was, "If that's the case, he'll be stinking on Almonaster," which is reference to him being a dead body found on Almonaster Boulevard out in the east, where they used to dump bodies.
Pride doth come before the downfall, huh? Well, I'm curious. You had mentioned earlier about an informant being in the inside. That reminded me of Sammy Williams. He turned against his partner in order to be a witness and to be a witness against him. What was the incentive? Because I'm sure
The
with
incentive was that he wasn't going to get the death penalty.
yeah, I mean that
Okay?
that is an incentive.
And quite frankly, to Sammy's credit, he could have gone silent and would have made life very difficult for us. Although I still believe we would have been able to convict both of them, because he was in the car with. No, he came after the murder, went into the car with Len Davis. He wasn't with them at the time that this was happening. They were in two different locations. Then they gathered once they heard the woman was murdered. But it took a lot to get him to cooperate. I'm not saying we twisted his arm or anything like that. I'm just saying that for an individual to be enmeshed with Len Davis for a long period of time, for him to turn on him, it took quite a bit of fortitude.
Absolutely. I mean, he did the right thing to make the conviction of Len Davis a lot easier.
He was put in protective custody too, so
I imagine there would be a target on his back after that.
maybe then you never knew what was going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Today, I hope nobody really is too concerned about Sammy Williams.
Yeah, I mean, with Len Davis being convicted, he did get the death penalty, and he is still on death row to this day. Is that
Yes.
correct?
Yes, I had left the office in 2005, but right around that time, they had to retry him on the penalty phase because of some technical issues. So he actually got sentenced to death twice. So the next time he did it, so he's still sitting on death row. Paul Hardy, for whatever reason, the judge determined that he was mentally unfit, so he was reduced to life imprisonment. But that was always a sore point for us because I mean, there was nothing to make us feel like he had some unusual mental ability to understand what he was doing. He knew very well what he was doing, as was evidenced by so many of the things that we heard during the tape recordings and even videos that we'd seen of him.
Was he evaluated by a psychologist?
He must have been. Yeah, he would have been, and a lot of that was more post conviction than prior to trial. So it just came out that way, and it's really, I mean, not that I'm a big proponent of the death penalty, but if anyone deserved to get it, Len Davis did.
Yeah, I mean, still no remorse to this day. I mean, that is
That's
quite
correct.
shocking. Can you explain to me legally why in the United States someone who would be convicted of the death penalty essentially twice would still be on it even almost 30 years later?
As long as they have some potential appeal issue pending, then it's not a final scenario in a judgment. So I mean, the judgment's final, but it's not over until it's over, as Yogi Berra said. And in his case, he still files a couple of frivolous motions. But I think that if they wanted to, they probably could bring forth his execution. I'll tell you what was, the Justice Department has an entire procedure that you have to go through before you can even get approval to seek the death penalty. So we had, there's a whole panel of people in Washington that review the case to see if it merits seeking the death penalty, and it's very thorough. But we had applied for months and months and months, and we were waiting to hear about whether we had the right to, we were given the ability to do it. And during that period of time, the bombing of Oklahoma City occurred. And the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, was on television. They didn't even have a suspect in custody, but she was on television saying that we're going to seek the death penalty for this case. So I made a slight remark to somebody in Washington. I said, well, we've had ours pending for several months. She's already approved one. And the next thing you know, they gave us approval to seek the death penalty.
Got the ball rolling on that, huh? Well, I mean, this is truly a fascinating case of corruption and having an innocent person get killed. And if anyone wants to know more, it's United States versus Len Davis, Len, Len Davis. But for our next story, one thing I am really excited to talk to you about is your story regarding the marriage and how that was proven to be fraudulent. This is on a much lighter note, but it's a story I think that definitely needs to be told, and I'm looking forward to hearing about it. So can you start off from the beginning and talk about the facts surrounding this case and the story behind it?
Well, I was a young prosecutor in the office at the time. The case of Len Davis had been there for a good 15 years. But probably within the first 2 years of being in the U.S. Attorney's Office, I mean, they're not going to hand you the most important case in the office to try. And one day, I was one of the areas that I was in charge of was they called it immigration then, and the immigration officials, inspectors came and said, well, look, we've discovered that there's a marriage ring out in Lafayette. There was a man from Egypt who was the manager of a tasty donut shop, and his top clerk worked for him, and he had all these individuals that had come from the Middle East to study at what used to be called USL, now it's called ULL University, and they were studying, they were good students studying, and but they wanted to stay in the country, and so the best way back then to stay in the country, this was before the movie Green Card, was to marry a U.S. citizen, and within a month you could probably have a permanent resident status, which is what the immigration officials would give you, which would allow you to apply for a passport. But that's the next stage before becoming a U.S. citizen is just becoming a permanent resident, which allows you to go in and out of the country whenever you want. You have to pay taxes. So these young students decided they wanted to stay. They wanted to get a U.S. passport. Is what they wanted, and they had an arrangement where they go to the Tasty Donut shop, and the woman that worked there was an American woman, and she would bring in these women who were really not stellar candidates for marriage. I mean, they were basically hookers and drug addicts, and all they wanted was the money. So they would meet at Tasty Donuts. Money would be exchanged. Then they would go do blood tests, get a marriage certificate, and then these guys would apply for a green card. So that's what we were calling marriage fraud. We're calling it a marriage fraud case. That's loosely put, but technically maybe not as accurate. And so they had done marriage fraud cases in the office before I had gotten there, and they'd never won one. And so they almost were laughing when they handed me the case because, they go, knock yourself out on this. Yeah. And so instead of trying to prosecute them for not having a proper marriage, because what is a proper marriage?
Yeah, how do you prove that?
That got very complicated. I said, let's just make it very simple. Let's just say that when they filled out the form to become a permanent resident, they stated that they were living together at this one address, and we knew that was a lie. So that's a false statement. I said, we'll just get them for a false statement in a document. And so that's what we did. And there must have been, I think there were 24 marriages, and almost all of them just pled guilty. All the women were cooperating already with immigration. So it was just the men that, they didn't want to get convicted, obviously, but they pled guilty, almost all of them. But one guy decided he was going to fight us. And I was like, oh, gosh. So he had married this woman. We'll keep the names out. But
we'll call her Jane Doe and him John Doe.
Yeah. Jane Doe had been a hooker since she was 14. She was, when she met him, I think she was 16 or 17. But she had been a hooker who had a pimp. And when I met her, she were missing front teeth, and I asked her what happened there, and she said her pimp had hit her in the back of with the back of his hand and broke her teeth, and she was very proud about that because she thought, well, he obviously cared for me if he was worried about me liking any of the customers that she went to. So I'm just saying that to give you an idea of what type of woman that she really was, and she was a fairly attractive woman in her own way, physically. But when we went to trial, the defendant took the stand, and we were cross-examining him. I said, now, isn't it a fact that you never really lived with her? He goes, yes, I did live with her. I said, well, I said, you did not live with her. You just hear her testify, oh, I lived with her for about 3 weeks, and then she left, and I didn't know where she went. I said, oh, so you lived with her for 3 weeks? I said, well, in that case, did you sleep in the same bedroom with her? Oh, yes, I did. I said, well, did you have sex with her? And he goes, well, no, I didn't. I said, you didn't have sex with her? You just got married in 3 weeks? He goes, well, she told me she was having her period. I said, for 3 weeks? He said, well, that's what she told me. I said, well, did you ever, but you slept in the same bed? Did you ever see her naked? He goes, yeah. Oh, yeah, I saw her naked. I said, in that case, can you identify any special marks that she might have on her body? Now he stops to think for a second, and he's trying to outguess me. So he's thinking, that there's a certain location where this mark is going to be. So he goes, I don't think I should say. I said, no, you have to say because I'm asking you the question. He goes, well, I really don't want to say. I said, you have to answer the question. Your Honor, please direct him to answer the question. Judge goes, answer the question. And he blurts out, on her pussy. I said, oh, okay, well, we'll get to that in a minute. I said, how about on her forehead or on her knee? Because she had scars on her knee and her forehead, that he didn't identify. So at that point, I said, Your Honor, I'd like to recall Jane Doe to the stand because she had already testified against him. So now there's a lot of commotion in the courtroom about me bringing her back in. The judge is nervous. What's going on? I said, well, Your Honor, all will be revealed, and just give me a little time here. He's got really nervous. So I brought her back in, and I said, listen, do you have any scars on your forehead? She goes, yes, I do. She showed a big old scar on her forehead, which was obvious. And I said, would you parade that down to the jury box? She did. She was proud of that. I said, yeah, any on your knees? She goes, yes. And she showed the knee and had scars on it. I said, now, I have to ask you something. Okay, so maybe I was a little theatrical at this point. And I said, it's a very delicate question, but do you have any scars or marks in your female genital region? And she just smiled with that big open mouth with no teeth in it. And she goes, no way, that's my money box. I don't let anything happen to that. So, of course, the jury falls over, this, that, and the other. He was convicted. And, to be honest, I mean, the judge said, look, he didn't arrest him right then and there. He says, come back for the sentencing. And he never did come back. He's probably in the Middle East somewhere. And hopefully wasn't one of the people in 911, because he was a tough little person.
What an awkward way to get caught in a lie. I mean, clear, because I can see his thinking of, like, if you're asking these very leading questions, he must think, oh my God, if he's asking if I've ever seen her naked, I need to, like, talk about an intimate place, and then he guessed wrong.
He guessed wrong. And he came up to me after the trial and he said, I always heard she had something there, I said, yeah, fine.
Oh, you heard it, huh?
Fine. But I mean, it was sort of a game we had to go through, but it was serious because it was a federal prosecution that was required to do at the time, and it is, who knows? I mean, these might have ended up being model citizens someday, but if you start off in a corrupt way, you're probably going to continue on that same path.
Well, and what a good lesson for lawyers, too, that sometimes taking the direct path to try and convict someone who's breaking the law, you have to do it in a roundabout way. I mean, look at Al Capone. He did not get caught for, all the crimes he committed being in the mafia. He got caught for tax fraud. So as a lawyer, you do have to get creative sometimes.
Well, and I think you have to be focused on what the end game is. And the end game is to obtain a conviction. If you're going to prosecute someone, you're not there just to do a good outing. You're there to convict somebody.
On a final note, is there any advice you would give to any aspiring attorneys and people who are in law school currently? And if there is anyone studying in New Orleans, if there is a place for them to go eat while they study, perhaps near Tulane University?
Well, my first advice would be, if you're in law school and want to be a trial attorney, it would behoove you to go to either the U.S. attorney or the district attorney or the public defender's office to learn how to try cases, because you really won't get that experience in big law firms. And they like you to have that experience and then move in if you want to do civil work later. So I thought I was only going to go there for 2 years to learn how to try cases, and I told the U.S. attorney at the time I'd be interested in staying 4 years. But I was thinking in the back of my mind, maybe 2 years would be enough. It was so much fun. It was so enjoyable that you make an okay amount of money. You're not going to, be sending a lot of kids to private schools on a government salary.
Right.
But it was so interesting for many, many years there that you got to deal with real life situations and felt like you were part of the solution from time to time, or at least the compensation.
And is there any place you would recommend these law students in New Orleans study?
Well, my favorite place, and it's good for your brain, is Dat Dog. If you go to Dat Dog, and there are vegan options, and there are any kind of dog you can imagine, from alligator to duck to Chicago to fried chicken to fish, so even a hamburger dog. And I notice that a lot of Tulane students do go to Dat Dog.
I have it on good authority that it is brain food. So I'll end off with this.
And good for your waistline, too.
Yeah. In a city whose history is filled with crime, temptation to cut lines and take the easy road can be overwhelming. This is all the more reason why having people fight for doing the right thing can mean the difference between a city and ruins. When someone offers you the easy route, do you take it? When someone offers you the forbidden fruit, will you bite it? When tasked with supporting your community and making your city a better place, will you be there to step up to the plate? Who are you really when the chips are down, a fighter or an accomplice? And that's it for Crescent Crime.
Okay.
Dancing in the moonlight on a bright night, a summer night in June, where doggies all are humming and strumming banjos to that Dixie tune, and soon you'll find them dancing.